everyone, it's Clarice, and today I'm going to be doing my October reading wrap-up to talk to you about the books that I read this October. And this may seem a bit strange because I haven't actually done a monthly reading wrap-up in over a year. And it was mainly because a year ago I felt like having these monthly wrap-ups were getting me into the mindset that reading was about the numbers and that it was about reading a lot of books every month. But now I think that I'm in the proper mindset and I now internalize the idea that reading better isn't about reading quicker or reading more. So I'm gonna try going back to monthly wrap-up videos because I think I'm strong enough in my mindset to not just go back to I need to read all the books because of monthly wrap-ups. So hopefully that works out. So a couple of things I want you to know about this month before I start talking about the books. First is this October was also Own Voices October, which is a readathon that was created by and hosted by Katie and Mel, whose channels I will link down below. So some of the books I'll be mentioning will be in line with the readathon. But the second thing, which is also the reason why I wasn't able to read as much Own Voices literature as I wanted to, is this month I wasn't able to spend much time reading because life happened. You know, a lot of life happened. Probably more life than I'd ever experienced ever. I'm going through a lot of stuff and that started happening in the middle of this month, so I really didn't feel like doing much reading at all. And that's totally fine. My emotional and mental health is way more important than the idea of being able to read consistently and regularly. The first 2 books I read this month I actually finished within the first 4 days of the month. And the remaining 3 books I read this month I finished reading on October 29. So yeah, there's a big chunk of time between that where I wasn't doing much reading at all. But anyway, on to the actual books. The first book I read this month was in line with Own Voices October, and that book was Wounded Little Gods by Eliza Victoria. And I'm from the Philippines, and this book is set in the Philippines, published in the Philippines, and written by a Filipino author. And I read this book because in the Diversathon I actually read another book by this author called Dwellers, and I enjoyed it so much. So I was super excited to read this book as soon as possible. It's a fantasy book that's a little bit creepy and has a bit of a mystery. I actually have a more detailed review on Goodreads, which I wrote right after reading this book. And you know that I had strong feelings about this book if I write a Goodreads review because I almost always just forget to write Goodreads reviews. What I really enjoyed about this book, which I also enjoyed about Dwellers, is that for most of the book the reader doesn't actually totally know what's going on, but it wasn't done in a way that got me frustrated, but it was instead done in a way that just made me get more and more curious and gain more and more questions as the book went along. And then it didn't just lead up to a conclusion of nothing or disappointment. It's like there's all this build-up and then there's a big chunk of the book just spent on like wrapping things up, you know, flashbacks, explanations, and it's done so well, especially in this book. I really like how it was done in this book, and I really like how the flashbacks were done and how it was giving more detail to things that you already read about. And so many times when it was at the concluding part in the book, I would go back to previous pages and read the events that were mentioned in the flashback, and being able to read it knowing what was actually happening, it was great, and I really enjoyed being able to do that. And overall, I love this book. I really enjoyed this book, and I really look forward to reading more of this author's work. Unfortunately, if you don't live in the Philippines, I'm not sure how you can get your hands on this book. But if you do manage to get your hands on Eliza Victoria's books, especially this one, please, I highly recommend that you read it because this is really good. The next book I finished reading this month was one that I actually started during the Slowathon, and so that was about a couple of weeks into September when that started, and then I finished it at the beginning of October, you know, taking the Slowathon spirit with me even after the Slowathon finished. And that book was Wicked by Gregory Maguire, and this was actually a reread that I read for the first time when I was 13 to 15 years old. I took 2 years to read it. Went into it with the wrong expectations, with the wrong mindset, with the wrong maturity level, and I didn't enjoy it that much. So I've been wanting to reread it for so long because I was wondering maybe now I'd be able to enjoy it more. I also wrote the Goodreads review of this, though my Goodreads review has less to do with the actual book and more with my experience of this book, because that was probably the best part of this book for me. It's being able to experience reading it the second time, and because I'm reading it the second time, I'm comparing my experiences now reading it with my experience the first time. And I was also able to compare the book with the musical, because the first time I read it, I actually hadn't watched the musical yet. I was also able to, now that I'm mature, be able to actually appreciate the more mature parts and not just be overwhelmed by it like I was the first time. And I also just really appreciated it as a fantasy book, which is not something I was able to do before because, believe it or not, I actually used to hate the fantasy genre. There was a lot of discussion about ethics and politics and culture and religion that I was so fascinated by that I definitely didn't appreciate the first time I was reading it. And now it just really made me think and really made me appreciate the complexity of this world so much. And so even though I think it's a really good book, based on, again, the world building and the characterization and those things, I think it's my favorite book, or one of my favorite books, not because of any of those things, any of those objective things, but because of my experience reading it. And as I mentioned, at this point, I didn't finish reading a book until October 29, though I did read a bit. But yeah, I didn't finish any of them until October 29 when I finished reading Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. This book is about a girl named Sunny, and Sunny is actually Nigerian, but she lived in America for a while, and then she moved back to Nigeria and lived there. She's also an albino, which means that her skin is actually really white and actually really sensitive to the sun, which I know is really ironic given that her name is Sunny. And she's always been really insecure about those things. And then suddenly in this book, she starts hanging out with a new group of friends and discovers the magical world of the leopard people and realizes that the things that she's insecure about could actually be the source of her power. I have mixed feelings about this book. In terms of the concept itself, you know, of the leopard people and the witches and the magic, that was really fascinating. I found it really interesting being able to learn about their culture and all the things they do and how their magic works and about their community. But at the same time, I wasn't all that impressed by the plot. There were times when I found it just too convenient and not very realistic, and I also felt that the plot was very predictable. You know, it was very formulaic at times, especially at the ending. Again, I really enjoyed the world and the culture and the leopard people, but the plot was kind of predictable. I almost forgot to mention I actually read Akata Witch for Own Voices October as well, and I just suddenly remembered to mention that because the next book I read on that same day was also an Own Voices book, and that book is Kare-kare Comics by Drilon. I didn't have much variety because this is another book from the Philippines by a Filipino writer and this time also artist because this is a comic, obviously. And I don't know how to explain this because it's a lot of different stories and they're not all even the same genre, and there's a good mix. Like, there were a lot of comics that were really light. Like, there's this comic about these characters that are on the way to the cover because they're excited to be like cover models or whatever, but they can't find their way to the cover and they get lost throughout the book. There's also a comic about a little girl that's just dreaming about outer space, and it's so cute. But there are also some comics that get really deep. Like, there's this one that's kind of about heartbreak, and this one just got so real. Really resonated with me at the moment because I had a friend that was going through something at the time that I read this. It really surprised me because I didn't expect some of the stories to be that deep, and a lot of them were deep in the sense that I don't feel like I totally understood it, but you know, I felt it. The main reason I actually bought it was because of the art. What is that? It's so good. But the stories were also so good. So I'm glad I bought it. I'm glad I read it. It was really good. Again, it's one that I'm not sure if you can get outside of the Philippines, but I will try to link his blog down below and any of the comics that I find on his blog that are here, and I hope that you do check them out because they're really good. And the last thing I read this month was Blacksad, A Silent Hell, which is the second volume, at least the second bound volume of Blacksad, though it is the fourth Blacksad story. But because it's a comic, because it's short, and also because it's kind of a mystery, I don't really want to explain any of the plot of this. Just know that I felt the same way about this as I felt about the first one. Obviously, the art is fantastic. All the characters are drawn as animals, and all the characters are just drawn really well. As I mentioned, I always love the expressions of the animals in these comics, which is a very specific thing to enjoy about comics. And another thing I mentioned about the first volume is that it didn't shy away from dealing with heavier themes. And this is just one story, but I felt like it dealt with a lot of heavier themes. And it was done really well. The story was done really well. The mystery was done really well. The art is done really well. I'm sorry if I don't really have much to say about this except that it was done really well, because it was. So those are all the books that I read this October. So how was your reading month this October? Do you have any Own Voices books to recommend to me? Because even though it's no longer October, I do want to continue reading more Own Voices books and adding more Own Voices books to my reading list. And what's your favorite thing that you read this October? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!